It will be approximately page 830 till about 840. The paragraph begins with "one may argue." That's where we're starting today. So you can try to find that in your Krishna book. And let's remember that we're all reading to Prabhupada, so let's be expressive and read slowly for his pleasure. One may argue that because this material world is created by the Lord, he is therefore responsible for its condition. Certainly, he is indirectly responsible for the creation and maintenance of this material world, but he is never responsible for the different conditions of the living entities. The Lord's creation of this material world is compared to a cloud's creation of vegetation. In the rainy season, the cloud creates different varieties of vegetation. The cloud pours water on the surface of the earth, but it never touches the earth directly. Similarly, the Lord creates this material world simply by glancing over the material energy. This is confirmed in the Vedas. He threw his glance over the material nature, and thus there was creation. In the Bhagavad-Gita, it is also confirmed that simply by his transcendental glance over the material nature, he creates different varieties of entities, both movable and immovable, living and dead.
The creation of the material world can therefore be taken as one of the pastimes of the Lord. It is called one of the Lord's pastimes because he creates this material world whenever he desires. This desire of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is also extreme mercy on his part because it gives the conditioned souls another chance to develop their original consciousness and thus go back to Godhead. Therefore, no one can blame the Supreme Lord for creating this material world.
From the subject matter under the decision, we can gain a clear understanding of the difference between the impersonalist and the personalist. The impersonal conception recommended mingling into the extent of the Supreme, and the Voidist philosophy recommended making all material varieties void. Both these philosophicals are known as the Mayavad. Certainly, cosmos manifestation comes to close and become void when the living entities mingle into the body of Narayana or to rest until another creation. And this may be called an impersonal condition. But these conditions are never internal. The sensation of the variedness of the material world and the mingling of the living entity into the body of the Supreme are not permanent, because the creation will take place again, and the living entities who mingled into the body of the Supreme without having developed their Krishna consciousness will again appear in this material world when there is another creation. The Bhagavad-Gita confirms the fact that the material world is created and alienated perpetually, and that conditioned soul without Krishna consciousness come back again and again whenever the material creation is manifested. If such conditioned soul take advantage of this opportunity and develop Krishna consciousness under the direct instruction of the Lord, then they are transferred to the spiritual world and do not have to come back to the material creation. It is said, therefore, that the Voidist and the impersonalist are not very intelligent because they do not take shelter under the lotus feet of the Lord. Because they are less intelligent, the voidists and the impersonalists take to the different types of austerity, either to attain the stage of nirvana, which means finishing the material condition of life, or to gain oneness by mingling into the body of Lord. All of them again fall down because they neglect the lotus feet of the Lord.
In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, the author Krishna Das Kaviraj Goswami, after studying all the Vedic literatures and hearing from all authorities, has given his opinion that Krishna is the only Supreme Master and that all living entities are his eternal servants. His statement is confirmed in the prayers by the personified Vedas. The conclusion is, therefore, that everyone is under the control of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Everyone is serving under the supreme direction of the Lord, and everyone is afraid of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is out of fear of Him that activities are rightly executed. Everyone's position is to be subordinate to the Supreme Lord. Yet the Lord has no partiality in His view of the living entities. He is just like the unlimited sky, as the sparks of a fire dance in the fire. Similarly, all living entities are like birds flying in the unlimited sky of the Supreme Lord. Some of them are flying very high. Some are flying at a lower altitude, and some are flying at a still lower altitude. The different birds are flying in different positions according to their respective abilities, but the sky has nothing to do with this ability. In the Bhagavad-Gita, the Lord confirms that He awards different positions to different living entities in proportion to their surrender. The proportionate reward by the personality of Godhead to the living entities is not partiality. Therefore, in spite of the living entities always being under the control of the Supreme Personality of Godhead in their different positions, spheres and species of life, He is never responsible for their different living conditions. It is foolish and artificial, therefore, to think oneself equal to the Supreme Lord, and it is still more foolish to think that one has not seen God. Everyone is seeing God according to his capacity. The only difference is that the theist sees God as the Supreme Personality, the most beloved Krishna, and the atheist sees the absolute truth as ultimate death.
The personified Vedas continue to pray. Dear Lord, they said, from all Vedic information, it is understood that you are the supreme controller and all the living entities are controlled. Both the Lord and the living entities are called Nitya, eternal, and so are quantitatively one, yet the singular Nitya or the Supreme Lord is the controller, whereas the plural Nityas are controlled. The individual controlled living entity resides within the body, and the Supreme Controller as Supersoul. It is also present there, but the Supersoul controls the individual soul. That is the verdict of the Vedas. If the individual soul will not control by the Supersoul, then how could one explain the Vedic version that a living entity transmigrates from one body to another and enjoys or suffers the effect of his past deeds, sometimes being promoted to a higher standard of life and sometimes being degraded to a lower standard? Thus, the conditioned souls are not only under the control of the Supreme Lord, but are also conditioned by the control of the material nature. This relationship with the living entities, with the Supreme Lord, as the control and the controller, definitely prove that although the Super Soul is all-pervasive, the individual living entity are never all-pervasive. If the individual souls were all-pervasive, there will be no question they are being controlled. The theory that the super soul and the individual soul are equal is therefore a polluted conclusion. And not sensible person accept it. Rather, one should try to understand the distinctions between the supreme eternal and the subordinate eternals.
Okay. The personified Vedas therefore concluded, O Lord, you are the unlimited eternal, Dhruva, and the living entities are the limited eternals. The form of the unlimited eternal is sometimes conceived as the universal form, and in Vedic literatures, like the Upanishads, the form of the limited eternal is vividly described. It is said therein that the original spiritual form of the living entity is 1/10,000 the size of the tip of a hair. It is also stated that spirit is greater than the greatest and smaller than the smallest. The individual, I'll let you use this one. The individual living entities who are eternally part and parcel of God are smaller than the smallest. With our material senses, we can perceive neither the Supreme, who is greater than the greatest, nor the individual soul, who is smaller than the smallest.
Well, the individual living entities who are eternally part and parcel of God are smaller than smallest. With our material senses, we can perceive neither Supreme, who is greater than greatest, nor the individual soul, who is smaller than smallest. From authoritative sources of Vedic literature, we have to understand both Him who is greater than greatest and Him who is smaller than smallest. The Vedic literature states that Super Soul is sitting within the heart of every living entity's body and is big as a thumb. Therefore, the argument may be put forward: how can something the size of thumb be accommodated within the heart of an ant? The answer is that this thumb measurement of super soul is imagined in proportion to the body of the living entity. In no circumstance, therefore, can super soul and individual living entity be taken as one, although both of them enter within the material body of living entity. The super soul lives within the heart to direct or control the individual living entity. Although both are Dhruva or eternal, the living entity is always under direction of the Supreme.
Can you give me the book? I missed this one. It may be argued that because the living entity are born of the material nature, they are equal and independent in the Vedic literature. However, it is said that the Supreme Personality of Godhead impregnates the material nature with the living entities and they come out. Therefore, the appearance of the individual living entity is not factual due to the material nature alone. Just as a child produced by a woman is not her independent production. A woman is first impregnated by a man and then a child is produced. As such, the chief produced by the woman is a part and parcel of the man. Similarly, the living entity are partly produced by the material nature, but not independently. It is due to the impregnation of the material nature by the Supreme Father that the living entity are present. Therefore, the argument that the individual living entity are not part and parcel of the Supreme cannot stand. For example, the different parts of the body cannot be taken as equal as the whole. Rather, the whole body is the control of the different limbs. Similarly, the parts and parcel of the Supreme Whole are always dependent and are always controlled by the source of the parts and the parcel. It is confirmed in Bhagavad-Gita that the living entity are part and parcel of Krishna. Mahamansha. No sane man, therefore, will accept the theory that the super soul and the individual soul are on the same category. They are equal in quality, but quantitatively the super soul is always the supreme and the individual soul is always subordinate to the super soul. That is the conclusion of the Vedas.
The significant word used in this connection is Yanmaya or Chinmaya. In Sanskrit grammar, the word Maya is used in the sense of transformation and also in the sense of fullness. The Mayavadi philosophers interpret that the word Yanmaya or Chinmaya indicates that the living entity is always equal to the Supreme. But one has to consider whether this affix Maya is used for fullness or for transformation. The living entity never possesses anything exactly in the same proportion as the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Therefore, this Mayat affix cannot be used to mean that the individual living entity is quantitatively equal with the Lord. The individual living entity never has full knowledge, otherwise how could he have come under the control of the Maya or the material energy? The word fullness can be accepted therefore only in proportion to the magnitude of the living entity. The spiritual oneness of the Supreme Lord and the living entities is never to be accepted as homogeneity. Each and every living entity is individual. If the homogeneous oneness is accepted, then by the liberation of the one individual soul, all other individual souls would have been liberated immediately. But the fact is that every individual soul is differently enjoying and suffering in the material world.
As mentioned above, the word Mayat is also used in the sense of transformation. Sometimes it is also used to mean byproduct. The impersonalist theory is that Brahman himself has accepted different types of bodies and this is his Leela or pastime. There are, however, many hundreds and thousands of species of life in different standards of living conditions, such as human beings, demigods, animals, birds, and beasts. And if all of them were plenary expansions of the Supreme Absolute Truth, then there would be no question of liberation, because Brahman would already be liberated. Another interpretation put forward by the Mayavadis is that in every millennium, different types of bodies are manifest, and when the millennium is closed, all the different bodies or expansions of Brahman automatically become one, ending all different manifestations. Then in the next millennium, according to this theory, Brahman again expands in different bodily forms. If we accept this theory, then Brahman becomes subject to change. But this cannot be accepted. From the Vedanta Sutra, we understand that Brahman is by nature joyful. He cannot, therefore, change himself into a body which is subject to so many painful conditions. Actually, the living entities are infinitesimal parts and parcels of Brahman, and as such, they are prone to be covered by the illusionary energy. As explained before, the particles of Brahman are like sparks blissfully dancing within a fire, but there is a chance of their falling from the fire to smoke, although smoke is another condition of fire. This material world is just like smoke, and the spiritual world is like a blazing fire. The innumerable living entities are prone to fall down to the material world from the spiritual world when influenced by the illusionary energy. It is also possible for the living entity to be liberated again when, by cultivation of real knowledge, he becomes completely freed from the contamination of the material world.
The theory of the Asuras is that the living entities are born of material nature or prakritis, in touch with the Purusha. This theory also cannot be accepted because both the material nature and the Supreme Personality of Godhead are eternally existing. Neither the material nature nor the Supreme Personality of Godhead can be born. The Supreme Lord is known as Aja or unborn. Similarly, the material nature is called Aja. Both these terms, Aja and Aja, means unborn. Because both the material nature and the Supreme Lord are unborn, it is not possible that they can beget the living entities, but it is accepted in the Vedic literature that as water is contact with air sometimes presents innumerable bubbles. So, a combination of the material nature and the Supreme Person cause the appearance of the living entities within the material world. As bubbles in the water, material world in different shapes and conditions influenced by the modes of material nature. Therefore, it is not improper to conclude that the living entities appearing within the material world in different shapes, such as human beings, demigods, animals, birds, and beasts, all get their respective bodies due to different desires. No one can say when such desires were awakened in them. And therefore it is said, Anadi Karma, the cause of such material existence, is untrackable. No one knows what material life began, but it is fact that it does have a point of beginning because originally every living entity is a spiritual spark. As a spark falling into the ground from a fire has a beginning, so a living entity coming to this material world has a beginning, but no one can say when, even though during the time of dissolution all the conditions living entities remain merged within the spiritual existence of the Lord. As it is deep sleep, their original desires to lord it over the material nature do not subside. Again, When there is cosmic manifestation, they come out to fulfill the same desires, and therefore they appear in different species of life.
Let's remember to look up once in a while, because we're reading the prophet, right? So if you're reading to someone, you want to look up and okay. And a little slower, so we really, the online devotees can really hear what we're saying.
The living entities merged into the Supreme at the time of dissolution are compared to honey. In the honeycomb, the tastes of different flowers are conserved. When one drinks honey, one cannot distinguish what sort of honey has been collected from what sort of flower, but the palatable taste of the honey presupposes that honey is not homogeneous, but is a combination of different tastes. Another example is that although different rivers ultimately mix with the water of the sea, this does not mean that the individual identities of the rivers are thereby lost. Although the water of the Ganges and the water of the Yamuna mix with the water of the sea, the river Ganges and river Yamuna still continue to exist independently. The merging of different living entities into Brahman at the time of dissolution involves the dissolution of different types of bodies, but the living entities, along with their different tastes, remain individually submerged in Brahman until another manifestation of the material world. As the salty taste of sea water and the sweet taste of Ganges water are different, and this difference continuously exists, so the difference between the Supreme Lord and the living entities continuously exists, even though at the time of dissolution they appear to merge. The conclusion is therefore that even when the living entities become free from all contamination of material conditions and merge into the spiritual kingdom, their individual tastes in relationship with the Supreme Lord continue to exist.
The personified Veda continue. Dear Lord, it is therefore our conclusion that all living entities are attracted by your material energy, and that only due to their mistakenly identifying themselves as the projects of the material nature are they transmigrating from one kind of body to another in forgetfulness of the eternal relationship with you. Because of ignorance, their living entities misidentify themselves in different species of life, and especially when elevated to the human form of life. They identify with a particular class of men or a particular nation or race or so-called religion, forgetting their real identity as eternal servant of your lordships. Due to this faulty conception of life, they are undergoing repeating birth and death. Out of many millions of them, if one becomes intelligent enough by associating with pure devotees, he comes to the understanding of Krishna consciousness and comes out of the jurisdictions of the material misconceptions.
Can we increase the volume of this mic? In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, it is confirmed by Lord Chaitanya that the living entities are wandering within this universe in different species of life, but that if one of them becomes intelligent enough, you can't have that sound, you have to balance it, right? That he begins his devotional life in Krishna consciousness. It is said, Harim Vina Namritam Taranti, Without the help of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one cannot get out of the clutches of repeated birth and death. In other words, only the Supreme Lord, the Personality of Godhead, can relieve the conditioned souls from the cycle of repeated birth and death.
The personified Vedas continue. The influence of time, past, present, and future, and material miseries such as excessive heat, excessive cold, birth, death, old age, and disease are all simply the movements of your eyebrows. Everything is working under your direction. It is said in Bhagavad-Gita that all material activity is going on under direction of Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krsna. The Vedas continue. All conditions of material existence are opposing elements for persons who are not surrendered unto you. But for those who are surrendered souls and are in full Krishna consciousness, these things cannot be source of fear. When Lord Nrsimhadev appeared, Prahlad Maharaj was never afraid of him, whereas his atheist father was immediately faced with death personified and was killed. Therefore, although Lord Nrsimhadev appears as death for an atheist like Hiranyakashipu, he is always kind and is the reservoir of all pleasure for devotees like Prahlad. A pure devotee is not therefore afraid of birth, death, old age, and disease.
Sripad Sridhar Swami has composed a nice verse in this regard, the meaning of which is as follows. My dear Lord, I am living entity perpetually disturbed by the condition of the material extreme. I have been cracked to pieces by the smashing wheel of the material extreme, and because of my various sinful activities while executing in this material world, I am burning in the blazing fire of the material reactions. Somehow or other, my dear Lord, I have come to take shelter under your lotus feet. Please accept me and give me protection. Srila Narottam Das Thakur also prays like this. My dear Lord, O son of Nand Maharaj, associate with the daughter of Vrishabhanu, I have come to take shelter under your lotus feet. After suffering great in the material condition of life, and I pray that you please be merciful upon me. Please do not kick me away, for I have no other shelter than you.
In the Chaitanya Charitamrita, the author Krishnadas Kaviraj Goswami, after studying all the Vedic literatures and hearing from all authorities, has given his opinion that Krishna is the only Supreme Master and that all living entities are his eternal servants. His statement is confirmed in the prayers by the personified Vedas. The conclusion is, therefore, that everyone is under the control of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Everyone is serving under the supreme direction of the Lord, and everyone is afraid of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. It is out of fear of Him that activities are rightly executed. Everyone's position is to be subordinate to the Supreme Lord, yet the Lord has no partiality in His view of the living entities. He is just like the unlimited sky, as the sparks of the fire dance in the fire. Similarly, all living entities are like birds, flying in the unlimited sky of the Supreme Lord. Some of them are flying very high, some are flying at a lowest altitude, and some are flying at a still lower altitude. The different birds are flying in different positions according to their respective abilities, but the sky has nothing to do with the ability. In the Bhagavad-Gita, the Lord confirms that He awards different positions to the different living entities in proportion to their surrender. This proportionate reward by the personality of Godhead to the living entities is not partiality. Therefore, in spite of the living entities always being under the control of the Supreme Personality of Godhead in their different positions, spheres and species of life, He is never responsible for their different living conditions. It is foolish and artificial, therefore, to think oneself equal to the Supreme Lord, and it is still more foolish to think that one has not seen God. Everyone is seeing God according to his capacity. The only difference is that the theist sees God as the Supreme Personality, the most beloved, Krishna, and the atheist sees the absolute truth as ultimate death.
I read after this or after you? Before. The conclusion is that any process of self-realization or God realization other than bhakti-yoga or devotional service is extremely difficult. Taking shelter of devotional service to the Lord in full Krishna consciousness is therefore the only way to become free from the contamination of material conditioned life, especially in this age. Those who are not in Krishna consciousness are simply wasting their time, and they have no tangible proof of spiritual life.
It is said by Lord Ramchandra, I always give confidence and security to anyone who surrenders unto me and decides definitely that he is my eternal servant. For that is my natural inclination. Similarly, Lord Krishna says in the Bhagavad-Gita, the influence of the material nature is insurmountable, but anyone who surrenders unto me can verily overcome the influence of material nature. The devotees are not at all interested in arguing with the non-devotees to nullify their theories. Rather than wasting time, they always engage themselves in the transcendental loving service of the Lord in full Krishna consciousness.
The personified Vedas continued, Dear Lord, although great mystic yogis may have full control over the elephant of the mind and the hurricane of the senses, unless they take shelter of a bona fide spiritual master, they fall victim to the material influence and are never successful in their attempts at self-realization. Such unguided persons are compared to merchants going to sea on a ship without a captain. By one's personal attempts, therefore, one cannot get free from the clutches of material nature. One has to accept a bona fide spiritual master and walk according to his direction. Then it is possible to cross over the nations of material conditions. Sripad Shiradhara Swami has composed a nice verse in this connection, in which he says, "O all-merciful spiritual master, representative of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, when my mind will be completely surrendered unto your lotus feet, at the time, only by your mercy, I shall be able to get relief from all obstacles to spiritual life, and I shall be situated in blissful life."
Actually, ecstatic samadhi, or absorption in the Supreme Personality of Godhead, can be achieved by constant engagement in His service. And this constant engagement in devotional service can be performed only when works under the direction of a bona fide spiritual master. The Vedas therefore instruct that in order to know the science of devotional service, one has to submit himself unto the bona fide spiritual master. The bona fide spiritual master is who knows the science of devotional service and disciplic succession. This disciplic succession is called Srotriya. The prime symptom of one who has become a spiritual master in disciplic succession is that he is 100% fixed in bhakti-yoga.
Sometimes people neglect to accept a spiritual master, and instead they endeavor for self-realization by mystic yoga practice. But there are many instances of failure, even by great yogis like Vishvamitra. Arjuna said in the Bhagavad-Gita that controlling the mind is as impractical as stopping the blowing of a hurricane. Sometimes the mind is compared to a maddened elephant. Without following the direction of a spiritual master, one cannot control the mind and the senses. In other words, if one practices yoga, mysticism, and does not accept a bona fide spiritual master, he will surely fail. He will simply waste his valuable time. The Vedic injunction is that no one can have full knowledge without being under the guidance of an acharya. Acharyavan Purusha Veda. One who has accepted an acharya knows what is what. The absolute truth cannot be understood by arguments. One who has attained the perfect Brahminical stage naturally becomes renounced. He does not strive for material gain, because by spiritual knowledge he has come to the conclusion that in this world there is no insufficiency. Everything is sufficiently provided by the Supreme Personality of Godhead. A real Brahmana, therefore, does not endeavor for material perfection. Rather, he approaches a bona fide spiritual master to accept orders from him. A spiritual master's qualification is that he is Brahmanishta, which means that he has given up all other activities and has dedicated his life to working only for the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krsna. When a bona fide student approaches a bona fide spiritual master, he submissively prays to the spiritual master, "My dear Lord, kindly accept me as your student and train me in such a way that I will be able to give up all other processes of self-realization and simply engage in Krishna consciousness, devotional service.
The devotee engaged by direction of spiritual master in transcendental loving service of the Lord contemplates as the follows. My dear Lord, you are the reservoir of pleasure. Since you are present, what is the use of the transient pleasure derived from society, friendship, and love? Persons unaware of the supreme reservoir of pleasure falsely engage in deriving pleasure from sense gratification, but this is transient and illusory. In this connection, Vidyapati, great Vaishnava devotee and poet, says, my dear Lord, undoubtedly there is some pleasure in the midst of society, friendship, and love, although it is materially conceived, but such pleasure cannot satisfy my heart, which is like desert. In desert there is a need of an ocean of water, but if only a drop of water is poured on desert, what is the value of such water? Similarly, our material hearts are full of multi-desires, which cannot be fulfilled by materialistic society, friendship, and love. When our hearts begin to derive pleasure from the supreme reservoir of pleasure, then we can be satisfied. That transcendental satisfaction is possible only in devotional service in full Krishna consciousness.
The personified Vedas continued, Dear Lord, you are Sat-Chit Ananda Vigraha, and every blissful from the form of a knowledge, and because the living entity are part and parcel of your personality, their natural state of existence is to be fully conscious of you. In this material world, anyone who has developed such Krishna consciousness is no longer interested in the materialist way of life. A Krishna consciousness being becomes uninterested in family life, where there is some connection of sense enjoyment. In other words, he is no longer interested in sense gratification. The perfection of a human life is based on knowledge and renunciation, but it is very difficult to attempt to reach the stage of knowledge and renunciation while in family life. Krishna conscious person therefore takes shelter of the association of devotee for satisfied place of pilgrimage. Such persons are aware of the relationship between the super soul and the individual living entity, and they are never in the bodily concept of life, because they always carry you in full consciousness within their heart. They are so purified that any place they go becomes a holy place of pilgrimage, and the water which washes their feet is able to deliver many sinful persons loitering within this material world.
When Prahlad Maharaj was asked by the atheistic father to describe something very good which he had learned, he replied to his father, for a materialistic person who is always full of anxieties due to being engaged in temporary and relative truths, the best course is to give up the blind bell of family life and go to the forest to take shelter of the Supreme Lord. Those who are actually pure devotees are celebrated as Mahatmas or great sages, personalities perfect in knowledge. They always think of the Supreme Lord and His lotus feet, and thus they automatically become liberated. Devotees who are always situated in that position become electrified by the inconceivable potencies of the Lord, and thus they themselves become the source of liberation for their followers and devotees. A Krishna conscious person is fully electrified spiritually, and therefore anyone who touches or takes shelter of such a pure devotee becomes similarly electrified with spiritual potencies. Such devotees are never puffed up with material opulences. Generally, the material opulences are a good percentage, education, beauty, and riches. But although a devotee of the Lord may possess all four of these material opulences, he is never carried away by the pride of possessing such distinctions. Great devotees of the Lord travel all over the world from one place of pilgrimage to another, and on their way they meet many conditioned souls and deliver them by their association and distribution of transcendental knowledge. They generally reside in places like Vrindavana, Madura, Dwaraka, Jagannath Puri, and Navadipa, because only devotees assemble in such places. In this way, they give saintly association to one another and thus advance, so that every living entities can take advantage of the association of Krishna conscious persons. Such great devotees who open temples and ashramas where Krishna's devotees assemble. By such association, people can develop more and more in Krishna consciousness. Such advancement is not possible in ordinary household life, which is devoid of Krishna consciousness.
The personified Vedas continued. Dear Lord, there are two classes of transcendentalists, the impersonalists and the personalists. The opinion of the impersonalist is that this material manifestation is false and that only the absolute truth is factual. The view of the personalist, however, is that the material world, although very temporary, is nevertheless not false but factual. Such transcendentalists have different arguments to establish the validity of their philosophies. Factually, the material world is simultaneously both truth and untruth. It is truth because everything is an expansion of the Supreme Absolute Truth, and it is untruth because the existence of the material world is temporary. It is created and it is annihilated. Because of its different conditions of existence, the cosmic manifestation has no fixed position. Those who advocate acceptance of this material world as false are generally known by the maxim Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. They put forward the argument that everything in the material world is prepared from matter. For example, there are many things made of clay, such as earthen pots, dishes, and bowls. After their annihilation, these things may be transformed into many other material objects, but in all cases, their existence as clay continues. As earthen water jug, after being broken, may be transformed into a bowl or dish, but either as a dish, bowl, or water jug, the earth itself continues to exist. Therefore, the forms of a water jug, bowl, or dish are false, but their existence as earth is real. This is the impersonalist version. The cosmic manifestation is certainly produced from the absolute truth, but because its existence is temporary. It is false. The impersonalist understanding is that the absolute truth, which is always present, is the only truth.
In the opinion of other transcendentalists, however, this material world being produced of the absolute, truth is also truth. The impersonalists argue that each is fallacious soul, and sometimes the spirit soul is produced from matter. Such philosophers push forward the argument that although cow dung is dead matter, sometimes it is found and scorpions comes out of cow dung. Similarly, dead matter like nails and hair comes out of the living body. Therefore, things produced of a certain things are not always of the same quality as that thing. On the strength of this argument, Mayavadi philosopher tried to establish that although this cosmic manifestation is certainly an emanation from the absolute truth, the cosmic manifestations does not necessarily have truth in it. According to this view, the absolute truth, Brahman, should therefore be accepted as truth. Whereas the cosmic manifestation, although a product of the absolute truth, cannot be taken as truth.
The view of the Mayavadi philosophers, however, is stated in the Bhagavad-Gita to be the view of the asuras or demons. The Lord says in the Bhagavad-Gita, Asatyam apratistam te jagat ahu anishwaram aparasupara sambhutam kim anyat kama haitukam. The Asura's view of this cosmic manifestation is that the whole creation is false. The Asuras think that the mere interaction of matter is the source of the creation and that there is no controller or God. But actually, this is not the fact. From the 7th chapter of the Bhagavad-Gita, we understand that the 5 gross elements, earth, water, fire, air, and sky, plus the subtle elements, mind, intelligence, and false ego, are the 8 separated energies of the Supreme Lord. Beyond this inferior material energy is a spiritual energy known as the living entities. The living entities are accepted as the superior energy of the Lord. The whole cosmic manifestation is a combination of the inferior and superior energies, and the source of the energies is the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Personality of Godhead has many different types of energies. This is confirmed in the Vedas. Parasha Shakti Vividhaiva Suryate. The transcendental energies of the Lord are variegated, and because such varieties of energies have emanated from the Supreme Lord, they cannot be false.
The Lord is ever existing, and the energies are ever existing. Some of the energy is temporary, sometimes manifest and sometimes unmanifested. But this does not mean that it's false. The example may be given that when a person is angry, he does things which are different from his normal condition of life. But the fact that the mood of anger appears and disappears does not mean that the energy of anger is false. Therefore, the argument of the Mayavadi philosophers that this world is false is not accepted by the Vaishnava philosopher. The Lord himself confirms that the view that there is no supreme causes of these material manifestations, that there is no God, and that everything is only the creation of the interactions of matter is a view of the Asuras.
The Mayavadi philosophers sometimes put forward the argument of the snake and the rope. In the dark of evening, a curled up rope is sometimes, due to ignorance, taken for a snake. But mistaking the rope for a snake does not mean that the rope or the snake is false. And therefore, this example, used by the Mayavadis to illustrate the falsity of the material world, is not valid. When a thing is taken as fact, but actually has no existence at all, it is called false. But if something is mistaken for something else that exists, that does not mean it is false. The Vaishnava philosophers use a very appropriate example, comparing the material world to an earthen pot. When we see an earthen pot, it does not at once disappear and turn into something else. It may be temporary, but the earthen pot is taken into its use for bringing water, and we continue to see it as an earthen pot. Therefore, although
the earthen pot is temporary and different from the original earth, we cannot say that it is false. We should therefore conclude that the earthen pot and the entire earth are both truth, because one is the product of the other. We understand from Bhagavad-Gita that after dissolution of this cosmic manifestation, the material energy enters into the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is ever existing with his varied energies, because material creation is an emanation from him. We cannot say that this cosmic manifestation is a product of something void. Krishna is not void. Whenever we speak of Krishna, he is the present with his four qualities: name, entourage, and paraphernalia. Therefore, Krishna is not impersonal. The original cause of everything is neither void nor impersonal, but is a supreme person. Demons may say that this material creation is an Ishvara, without controller or God, but such arguments ultimately cannot stand.
The example given by Mayavadi philosopher that intimate matter, nail and hair comes from the living body is not very sound argument. Nails and hairs are undoubtedly intimate, but they come not from the intimate living being, but from the intimate material body. Intimate material body. Similarly, the argument that the Scorpio comes from the cow dung means that a living entity comes from the matter is also unsound. The Scorpio which comes out of the cow dung is certainly a living entity, but the living entity does not come out of the cow dung. Only the living entity, material body or the body of the Scorpio comes out of the cow dung. The spark of the living entity, as we understand from Bhagavad-Gita, are injected into the material nature and they come out. The body of the living entity in different forms is supplied by material nature. but the living entity himself is supplied by the Supreme Lord. The father and the mother give the body necessarily for the living entity under certain condition. The living entity transmigrates from one body to another according to his different desires, which is subsistent from the intelligence, mind and false ego, accompanying him from the body to body by
By superior arrangement, a living entity is put into the womb of a certain type of material body, and then he develops a similar body. Therefore, the spirit soul is not produced from matter. It takes on a particular type of body under superior arrangement. According to our present experience, this material world is a combination of matter and spirit. The spirit is moving the matter. The spirit soul, the living entities and matter are different energies of the Supreme Lord. And since both the energies are products of the Supreme Eternal or the Supreme Truth, they are factual, not false. Because the living entity is part and parcel of the Supreme. He exists eternally. Therefore, for him there cannot be any question of birth and death. So-called birth and death occur because of the material body. The Vedic version, Sarvam Kala Vidam Brahma, means that since both the energies have emanated from the Supreme Brahman, everything we experience is non-different from Brahman.
So this chapter, the prayers of the personified Vedas, is the longest chapter of Krishna book. And I remember last year it took us a couple of weeks to get through it, but that's okay. So we'll end our hour of reading Krishna book to Srila Prabhupada, and with deep gratitude we would like to thank Srila Prabhupada for allowing us to come here and read to him. And let us offer our respectful obeisances to Srila Prabhupada and to each other. Namo Vishnupadaya Krishna Prastaya Bhutale Srimati Bhakti-Vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pacharane Nirvasesha Sunyavadi Paskachadi Shatarane. To each other, Vanchakalpadrubhis cha, Kripa Sindhu Bhyeva cha, Patitanam Pavanebhyo, Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. So next week, we'll continue with the prayers of the personified Vedas. Bring your Krishna book. Hare Krishna.
20 pages more.
Oh, okay. Mataji said 20 pages more. Okay, Hare Krishna.